Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. It's so nice to see you today.
Same, Stella. It's great to see you.
For those who are listening, Amanda and I actually first met about a little over 2 months ago during the World Mental Health Day Summit in Hudson Yards with Project Healthy Minds. Shout out to that organization. Incredible work that they're doing. And I got to hear you speak on a panel about all the really fantastic work that's being done at the Center for Health Communication. And, the panel initially drew my eye because it was about social media and the ways in which creators communicate about topics related to mental health and well-being. So, as one can imagine, my ears perked up and I was like, I need to go listen. And it was just fantastic. So really, really thrilled to have you here today on the show. And I want to start off by talking a little bit more about your own background. And I know that you have a career in news and journalism and now public health at Harvard. So would love for you to share a little bit more about your own career path and how you eventually became involved with the Center for Health Communication.
Yeah. So I'm a scientist by training. And then, as you mentioned, I spent 2 decades working in journalism as a science reporter, as an editor, and eventually as a newsroom leader. In that role, I used to run editorial teams, product teams, but also an audience team. So, really thinking carefully about who is reading us and all the other folks that are talking about the same things we are and how to interact with them.
It's so fascinating coming also from a news background as well, but also a science background too. When I was younger, I thought I wanted to be a doctor first and foremost. I was so interested in medicine. And then I also had this passion for journalism and writing and that more like creative rights brain side. And so I thought, maybe science journalism is the way forward. And that never really actualized in my career. Maybe the podcast is a form of that because it blends all of these topics together. But I think it's actually really fascinating and really important, more so, to have that science background if you're going into the field of journalism and communication, because of now sitting in this climate of just mental health issues rising, especially among the younger generations. So just curious to hear a bit more about, how your background in science informed the way in which you worked as a journalist and now through the work that you're doing at Harvard.
Yeah, it absolutely did. I mean, I think I teach sometimes around science and how scientists can interact with journalists here at Harvard. And one of the things I talk about is, there's actually a tremendous amount of similarities between how we think, I think, right? Like both scientists and journalists, they're really interested in finding the truth. They are really interested in understanding problems in communities and looking for solutions. And they have, I think the best scientists and the best journalists, they really care about their audience and doing something that's going to benefit the community around them. So for me, it was really important, and it really has shaped not only my scientific training, shaped not only my career as a journalist, but absolutely my career here at Harvard. So I landed here a little more than a year and a half ago, and I was recruited to reboot the Center for Health Communication here at Harvard Chan. It had been around for 35 years and had a really storied history doing mass media campaigns that really changed the health of our nation here in the United States in particular. But it had been 35 years and they were looking for new leadership. Our former director was moving on, and they wanted someone to come in and think about what that center would look like in 2022, I think at the time, 2023. And so, so I came on and had thought carefully about, in the past, those mass media campaigns that the center had done, they really thought about all the channels we were watching, the things we were watching together, right? The TV that we were watching together, the news programs that we were watching together, all the things that we were consuming collectively, and thinking about how to inject public health messaging into that and content into that programming. Thinking about what that would look like in 2023, it was obvious to me that it had to look beyond like TV shows and even Hollywood, and really thinking about, or even the news, and really thinking about creators. They're watched and trusted by millions. We're looking to them for information, all kinds of information, right? Including health information and increasingly mental health information.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like the rise of creators, influencers, micro influencers, whatever terminology you want to use, it kind of happened overnight. Maybe it was actually the onset of COVID where this really blew up. And I think honestly, even TikTok was that platform that transformed the way in which we think about creators. I actually started Everyday Endorphins 10 years ago in 2013. I guess by the time this episode's released, it'll be almost 11 years ago. And at the time, it was like this food and fitness blog. And there were a few health accounts that existed, but I don't think anyone at the time would have called themselves a creator. It was more just like a blogger. So it's been interesting to see the evolution of that. But why do you think influencers, creators have been given so much attention in the media? Like how, in your eyes and your perspective, how did that just happen seemingly overnight?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, I think COVID is a big issue in the sense that I think we were all looking for connection and to see our experiences reflected. And I think that allowed another thing that's really changed is I think this idea, I grew up in that sort of blogging culture too, right? I think a lot of creators now, if they were around then, they would have been blogging, and the ones who were around then were blogging, right? So I do think that has been a natural evolution, but platforms like TikTok, for example, have really helped discoverability, right? I think it's not so much like you have to know, a person has to find you the platform. I think the discoverability, the algorithm that they have created it's sort of a delight in, well, it can be a delight in discoverability. It has made things easier to find. So I think that's one thing has changed. I think COVID, people were looking for something. And then I think the third thing that I would say has changed is a sort of understanding of like a rawness. And I think what creators today are really understanding is that authenticity is how we're going to connect. And I think that is really connected to our COVID experience, for example.
Yeah, like that desire to also see yourself reflected in a creator helps foster a sense of closeness and connectedness. And you're right, COVID really shook things up. And I think also sparked this understanding of just immense loneliness that a lot of people were feeling as well. And then having a platform like social media where you could actually talk about it. And I don't want to say destigmatize, but yeah.
Where you can share that, right? You understand that other people are experiencing it too, right? I think that really, I don't know whether any of those three things would have cut through all by itself, but I think together it's really important. I mean, when you think about it in the past, so much of our so many of our media gatekeepers have looked like, only a certain segment of the population. And I think what's really sort of amazing and beautiful about the creator economy is that there are now so many voices available, right? And so many voices surfaced. And I think that is exactly what we needed in a time like COVID. And I think it's exactly what we need in the future.
Even just seeing the evolution of how we consume our news and information, coupled with the rise of creators and social media, this honestly will not surprise you, but I mostly consume my information through Instagram and through TikTok.
I think you're not alone.
Right.
Right. I think for a lot of young people, TikTok and Instagram are increasingly a search engine, a first step for news and information. But it's not just young people. I saw some Pew data out this year suggesting that, more than half of US adults get news at least sometimes from sites like those.
There's this irony and paradox even that exists because we're glued to our phones. That's where we're receiving a lot of our information, yet being on social media deeply impacts our mental well-being. I see it myself, honestly. I have this urge to reach for my phone to look at something, just to hold it. It's like this compulsive behavior that I have because I've become so addicted to this device and to social media. But at the same time, it's what I use to also inform and educate myself to a certain extent. And then even having the podcast, sure, the content here exists over just having conversation and building community in this way. But in a way, I also need this Instagram profile for the show to promote the conversations that are being had and make sure it's even more widespread. So there's this paradox that exists where, we're so deeply tied to our phones and it benefits us in so many ways. And there's that sense of, when you're following creators, maybe you feel closer to them or you feel a sense of connectedness, but there's also this deep isolation, loneliness, and detriment to our well-being. Can you talk a little bit more about this paradox and how you see media impact our well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I think media has always impacted our well-being, right? Like all kinds of media, whether it was like the beginning of radio, the beginning of television, right? Technology has never been this like, oh, it's wonderful or oh, it's absolutely terrible, right? Like these kinds of technology advancements in how we consume media have always been really, fraught, right? Full of a lot of good and also coming with some bad as well, right? I personally experienced this after working in journalism for a really long time, just like you are, Stella. Like it really mattered. You had to have a presence on social media. It was part of your business. But I haven't had, for example, Instagram installed in my phone for 5 or 6 years. I purposely make it less enjoyable for myself by using it only in browser, in part because I think what is almost required of us as individuals these days is that we all have to sort of like build our own amount of self-awareness and our own amount of self-control in the absence of other things. I think that there are lots of, that's not a solution that's a long-term. I think we need as a society to think about, those are smart individual moves to like set some boundaries and create some friction of our own that lets you get some of the good, right? The connectedness, the ideas, the inspiration, right? The information that you want that's easy to get, right? All of those things, but also set up some friction that helps you with some of the other things, which, I think can be really hard to tolerate.
Right. And I mean, there's small choices you can make also.
Absolutely. You have some control over it. But, I also think like that shouldn't stop. Recognizing that we all have choices that we could make to do that, I think shouldn't stop us from also asking ourselves collectively, what do we want? Right. Yeah. So I hopefully, in my mind, we'd each do both of those things. Right.
How would you envision that to look like, actually? Like in addition to having maybe your own personal boundaries or creating that awareness for yourself on re-engaging with social media in a more healthy way, how would you envision like collectively we all hold each other accountable, or on a larger scale, like maybe this brings in policies that are helping to shape the way that we engage with our social media? How do you see it on a broader scale?
Policy changes are going to have to come. I think it's just a question of, do we have the right people in the rooms to make the decisions, right? And one of the things that we've really hoped for through this program at Harvard was to do a better job bringing creators, mental health creators in particular, who I think have this sort of very interesting, they're not just creators, but they are also working in the mental health space where so many of these questions that we're talking about sit, and thinking about how do we bring creators, mental health creators, into those conversations with, mental health experts, technology experts, regulatory experts, legal experts who are already talking about what kinds of policy changes might work. I think that's an important and exciting area in my mind, like, by helping creators in the ways that we have here at Harvard, we would also connect those creators both with each other to help their audiences and, with the wider community that are going to be making decisions about policies and how we want these environments to be for each other.
Mm-hmm. This is a great segue into speaking more about the Creator Summit. So this was a big topic of conversation during the panel for World Mental Health Day. And it's really a fascinating summit that you all put together because it seems like this very symbiotic relationship between the researchers at Harvard and the resources at Harvard, and then also the creators coming into this program where there's this like symbiotic learning experience between the two. So I would love for you to talk a little bit more about, I think you touched on this earlier, really kind of like the inspiration behind the summit, but diving a bit deeper into how Harvard and the creators were able to come together to help people better engage with social media or receive information about mental wellness through these platforms in a more conducive way.
Yeah, and I think we have lots of work to do, but I'm happy to talk about, sort of where we started and what was the inspiration. So, I mean, as we talked about before, right? So many people are looking for information on these kinds of platforms. It's totally true of health information, maybe particularly about mental health information, since so many of of these platforms became, as we discussed, a place that we were looking for support around mental health during COVID, right? And I think that just hasn't changed. On TikTok alone, I looked at these numbers recently. There are already well over 100 billion views of videos tagged with the mental health hashtag alone, right? So there's a huge amount of information, but that ecosystem is, unfortunately, I think, awash with both deliberate misinformation and anecdotal posts that are not grounded in science, as well as some really great content that we found in looking for creators for this program. So there's everything there. And unfortunately, I think it's really hard for many of us to distinguish between sound and spurious science, right? So we were thinking, how could we make sure that people can find the health information that they need where they're looking for it, right? I think sometimes I hear people sort of say, oh, well, you shouldn't look for this information on social media. Unfortunately, we're all looking for, increasingly we're getting information there. It's where we're at. And so I think we have a responsibility, particularly in public health, right? We have a responsibility to recognize that all of our spaces, we should be thinking about making sure that people have access to great health information. And so that's going to require partnerships and new kinds of collaboratives that haven't existed before, right? So we, creators, they're watched, trusted by millions. And so we wondered whether could they help play a role in making sure that all people everywhere have that kind of health information that they want and need. Trust in institutions has been in decline, including some that public health has relied on to circulate health information in the past, especially since COVID. And, so I think public health institutions, Harvard included, that are hoping to change views and habits in today's world, they're going to need, new kinds of approaches and new coalitions that, like I said, don't exist right now, including those with creators. So that is why that's sort of where we were thinking when we came up with this program. We wanted to build a system that would help support creators who want to spread evidence-based information about mental health. I was a journalist for many years, and I benefited many times, as did my teams, from all of the effort that science organizations, health organizations, institutions of all kinds, the access that they provide to journalists as being trusted media gatekeepers. And I think it's time we think about how we build those kinds of systems for creators who are today's media gatekeepers.
Yeah, I think there's two parts to this as well. When first, it's just hard to figure out where you can access certain mental health resources. Even if you're tapped into the mental health field, it's well, where do I even begin? How do I find a therapist? What exists out there? So just having someone or a creator that you can go to and they're able to provide you, at least point you in the right direction to the right resources, I think is huge, because it's easy to feel lost as to where to even begin, right? And then secondly, from my own experience, what I've seen on social media with a lot of creators is them sharing their own advice and their own lived experience. And I think that those pieces of content are actually really helpful because it feels really relatable. It feels like you're just listening to your best friend on the phone or an older sister telling you, this is what I learned in my 20s, for example, right? But a lot of this is very subjective. And so sometimes it feels like, how do I know that this is the right advice to follow? And so what's been really helpful for me is following content where it's lived experience coupled with neuroscience and science-backed research and findings that help to explain maybe this is why you think the way that you do, or this is why you're behaving in this way. And so what I try to do is follow the people online that have that blend of the personal, but also the science and academic findings to support it. Because I know also with a science background in my undergraduate studies, I feel more in control of my own well-being when I can actually understand from a neuroscience perspective and from the most fundamental building blocks why it is the way that these things are for me in particular. And so I think there's definitely a need for that as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think those are the kinds of creators that we were hoping to engage and empower and connect with each other so that, that they can also lift each other up, right, in these kinds of crowded, noisy spaces as well.
Yeah, I saw on the website, there was just an immense list of creators, and just would love to hear more how you were able to kind of select who to involve in the summit and what that looked like.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. We didn't pick a random group of people to engage, but we also, I think, really importantly, since we're scientists, myself included, we really approached this as an experiment, right? Really wanted to roll out a program that we thought would help creators, right? And help us in the process. And we can talk a little bit more about that, I think, later in the call. But, but really know whether we're doing good, right? Know whether it's having the effect that we wanted. So that's really, I think, an integral part of what we did. So our students and faculty here, mental health students and faculty here, identified a total of 105 or so creators who were talking about mental health on TikTok in particular. We were looking for people who, were producing across platforms, but because TikTok is such a great discovery engine, and because it's such a huge source of mental health information for so many people right now, and just because of the popularity of the topic on the platform, we were looking for creators who were certainly, that was one of the channels that they were working on. We took a group of those 105 folks and put them aside and never contacted them again, and used that as a control group. And then we invited the remaining 70 or so to apply for a slot in the summit to spend some time virtually with us in April and our faculty in a series of virtual conversations around mental health and mental health policy. 42 of them said yes, and we randomly selected 25 to join us in April to discuss mental health research and policy prescriptions, and also how to actually share evidence-based information on mental health, some, research from health communication research. Those 25 folks received toolkits that summarized some of the themes and evidence that we discussed. And then the other 17 creators who applied, we sent them only those toolkits and then compared the content those groups of creators made before and after the summit. So that's how we went about it. But the group of people that we were really interested in interacting with, we wanted to talk to people who were creators who were doing this in very different ways, not all the same, right? So we had around half of the creators on our list of 105, right, that we started with were mental health providers who had come to TikTok to have a bigger impact than they could merely by seeing patients. And then around half of the folks came purely from lived experience to share the experience that they had had with other people in an effort to, really help reduce stigma about seeking care and things like that. And I think importantly and interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, there's a lot of overlap between those two groups, right? A lot of the providers do have lived experience as well, the ones who have been quite successful in this platform. So we were interested in engaging both kinds. We weren't sure who might find this kind of program most valuable, who would be most interested or get the most out of it. We were looking for folks, and I think this has a lot to do with what TikTok is and some of the benefits, and not just TikTok, but I think this is true in YouTube and Instagram too, where there are voices that often in sort of general society get marginalized, and there's a way to cut through there, right? To find audiences, folks that you can see their experience in yours, right? And so, really reaching some audiences that public health has failed to reach in the past, creators of color, who identified as creators of color, folks who identified as LGBTQ, for example, and other sort of marginalized populations. We were really interested in overpopulating this group of 105 with folks like that in an effort, because we also wanted to learn from them, right? How they were really doing such a great job, connecting and building community and trust with folks. And we purposely, pushed aside folks who were deliberately, we saw sharing misinformation, right? So true, intentionally sort of what I would say like maybe a bad actor, that's perhaps a strong word, but we're looking for folks who really, I think, trying to do great work in this space, but doing it in very different ways that we would, for example, and that each other were doing it. And I think, we took a big tent approach, while I think not trying to engage folks who were, perhaps signaling overtly or less so that like TikTok is therapy, for example, right? So we're looking for folks who understood what sort of the limits were, really trying to do the best work possible.
Yeah. How did you see, if you saw at all, the content differ between the people that were actually participating in the summit and involved in the virtual conversations and dialogue with that toolkit versus those who just received the toolkit and weren't actually present during the experience?
Well, very interestingly, we saw that getting the toolkit was the real value, right? Like, which says to me that there's a hunger for good information that a creator, packaged in a way that's helpful to a creator, which a lot of good scientific information is not. Right? It's written for scientists and not for others who are perhaps outside that expert circle, right? And so, yeah, that was a surprise to us. I mean, I had obviously like built this experiment to sort of to test that, but I was thinking it would be an additive thing. And I think for us, it was really like fascinating and kind of exciting thing because it suggests that something like this could scale, right? That you could, these are really relatively simple toolkits to put together, and that we could reach a lot more creators and have a much bigger impact than I think we thought originally could be possible. So yeah, it's really the toolkits. Now, that's not to say I think there are lots of other things that coming in contact with each other has brought. So I think I've run a media operation before, as you do. And so I'm sure you're aware, right? You have to feed the beast, right? Like there's always this like need for content if you're going to be a successful creator, right? It is what's required, what your audience expects of you, what the platform requires of you, all of those things. And so, and particularly with creators who, are well-intentioned, really are mission-driven to provide a service to those seeking mental health information, that's a lot. That's a lot. And so if we could, do something that's helpful to ease their research, to make it easier for them to share information, even on a subject that they maybe that's sort of next door to their expertise, if you will, I think that's where I see that program being, potentially really useful to creators and where we could be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a really great point that you mentioned around making science terminology, research actually digestible. And it's interesting because you kind of walk in the middle of those two worlds as a scientist and a journalist. You can see both perspectives, but I think it more so really clarifies the importance of translating that language into something that most people can understand. It's kind of like asking the so what. Sure, you can just throw a bunch of research and findings and papers to people, how meditation impacts maybe like the gray matter in your brain or other neurological conditions or just your general health and well-being at large. But to actually digest that and understand the so what, how does that show up in my life? What steps can I take? If there's not that connection, I don't think people feel empowered to actually make those changes.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I think there's two issues here, right? Like I think the scientific literature where we store information, expertise, right? It was built to share it with other scientists, right? It's made for that. That is how the product is designed. It's not made for somebody outside of science to walk in and say, oh, this is what this means, and this is how it fits into the larger context, right? Because so much of science builds on other things. It's not a single paper. Reading a single paper is the key. It's reading a series of papers and analyzing how they fit together. And so I think that's one part of it, right? That part of science is locked up. I actually think creators do an amazing, like there are so many creators who understand how to make complexity interesting, right? I mean, they're really good at, we don't need to teach, we actually need to learn from them how to do that. I actually think when I think of some of the creators that we've worked with, and I think about how they're using skits and role playing and music and all kinds of other things that science and scientific organizations, they do not use that humor, right? All these things. And I think they do an amazing job. But of course, there's like some middle stuff there, right? Where you need to get some information out of this very complex, like not built for you system to help, what is it, what messages are important, what information is important that people need to know. And I think that's the part where we need better systems, that sort of brokering system to empower folks like in our program to do a better job as being the public health leaders that they already are, I would argue.
Yeah. I think creators do a really fantastic job of making these topics actually entertaining.
That's a job that scientists they're not trained to do, and we often don't do it well.
Right, exactly. And a lot of the creators, perhaps, that are also mental health professionals or doctors, physicians, like actually, like their career sits in science, but they also have this really creative side of them where they're creating content. That's really like a special blend of the two because they have that knowledge and then they're able to express it and share it in a way that will hit most people. And so maybe the goal moving forward is, well, how do you get other creators who maybe don't necessarily have that training or background with that same level of research and information, but you leave it to them to repackage it and repurpose it and share it out in a way that is widely applicable to others?
I mean, I definitely think one of the things that I see in the future of public health communication is needing to understand that we're going to have to hand over some agency to gatekeepers to be able to share information, right? Empower them, educate them, support them, right? But not control that, right? Like we're sort of past the point where people are going to listen to a central authority, right? For their information. We're just going to push it out via that one channel, right? The future is distributed and creators are going to be part of that. It's interesting, Stella, one of the things we looked at in the study was whether the toolkits that we provided people were creators were more valuable to or more useful used by creators who had lived experience only versus they were coming to it with a provider background, perhaps also coloring in their lived experience as well in many cases. But right, like we were interested, would one of those groups find that more valuable? We found that they were both equally, we saw no difference, right? And so anecdotally, I think what you described is exactly true. Some of our folks who are coming from lived experience, they want to give good information, and the kind of toolkits and supports that we've been offering help them, sort of reduce the amount of effort that they have to put into their, fact checking and, research, and allows them to create, which is what they do best, instead of spending hours and hours trying to figure out what they should create about, right? And so I think in that sense, we're helping them. But what we also heard from some of our trained creators, trained like mental health provider creators, is that, they specialize in something, right? And there are all kinds of other areas that they don't specialize in. And sometimes there's lived experience that they don't have, right? But, if they want to talk about something broader than what their sort of core area is, this is also helping them in that area. So I think there are ways in which the supports that we're offering are helping both kinds of creators, which is, again, we didn't know what to expect there, but it's been heartening to see. We're now in the future in 2024 about to embark on some research about, how to really sharpen the toolkits that we're providing, right? Like how should we present them, on what topics, how do people expect them to be delivered? Is a toolkit really the right delivery method, or should we be really building some sort of AI driven assistant of some kind that provides it, right? I think so. Thinking through, to me, what we've learned here is that helping summarize research in an area in a way that speaks to what creators need is a thing that public health institutions, science institutions can do to improve the information ecosystem on these channels, right? And that is something we should all care about and therefore invest in. And I think in the future, the questions become, how best to do that.
Yeah, these are very lofty questions. And, when you say toolkit, what exactly does that mean? Like, what consists, of that toolkit?
In this like pilot version, what the toolkit looked like, it was inspired by looking at what brands offer creators, right? I mean, in that situation, a brand is asking the creator to make content on their behalf, like in their voice, but on their behalf. And we weren't interested in that kind of control, but we were thinking that, this is a well-oiled machine right? They've thought about this and built it in ways that helps creators make content. So we looked at that. We interviewed some creators about how they would, what they would want from something like this. We talked to some folks who were working like influencer marketing firms who worked with creators and were often the brokers of these kinds of brand deals and that sort of thing. So we looked at sort of what was out there in the more like paid sponsorship area as a model of presentation. And then we thought about from a science journalist perspective, right? Like what kind of information did we think that creators might be missing, right? Was it a topic that was not talked about enough or at all? And so we did some work around that. So for example, one example there I would give is a lot of mental health creators are not talking about climate. There's some stuff that's happening on the climate side. It largely comes out of climate creators, doesn't often come out of mental health creators. And increasingly, as the world is changing, and more people are experiencing climate anxiety or the mental health impacts of a changing climate, we wanted more mental health creators to be able to talk about that. It's interesting, you're seeing that happening more in like mental health provider training. It's happening more. But of course, that's happening right now. And we're hoping to sort of accelerate things. So that's an example of like, maybe we were looking for, in some cases, we're looking for areas where we didn't see people talk. There's something that people could be talking about, but they're generally not so much, right? And then in other cases, we looked for topics where maybe, people are talking about a topic, but there's a dimension that we thought perhaps might be missed, for example. So in that sense, we thought about like the mind-body connection, right? Which I think is talked about a lot on social media, for example, but rarely do you see folks getting into not at all, but like not as much do you see people really talking about what do we know about the molecular basis for that, right? So what's the scientific underpinnings for that? And so that's an example where we thought, okay, there's something we could add to the conversation, right? And to an existing conversation. So, right. So that's format we've talked about, and then topics. And then what about the content? We're really looking to think about what would a creator need, right? So certainly some references we provided, but really are focused on, what are some key big numbers and statistics in these areas that like are vetted, authoritative, right? That sort of scope out the problem or scope out the solution, research trends and emerging ideas. And then, really thinking through like what specific calls to action you could share. And we weren't interested in being really prescriptive there, but offering up some very specific, if you wanted to send somebody to something more, here's a place, here's another example, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, this thought just popped into my mind. I feel like you can think of these creators in this program kind of as ambassadors of the research that's been conducted. There would be the right way to describe it, but that's kind of just what I thought of initially.
We are definitely thinking about how, and we had a conversation with a number of our creators who ended up joining us later in the year in person. Some of the folks who joined us in April for this virtual summit, we hosted them in August. And one of the conversations that I thought was most striking, and I think you saw it at the Project Healthy Minds event as well, is that so many of these creators, as a result of this program, are reframing. They're telling us that it's reframed how they think of themselves, right? Is that they actually are public health leaders in the sense that they are communicators. They are connecting much wider audiences with important mental health information. And I think, many of them, that's not how they thought about themselves, like walking into this, right? They thought of themselves as creators, maybe advocates, right? Mental health advocates, being passionate about reducing stigma and helping people connect to help that they need, right? They were thinking about themselves that way, but they didn't necessarily think about the sort of the larger role that they might play as being a piece of public health. And to me, that's exactly how we would like them to think about themselves. And so I think sort of a side impact of this program, in addition to changing content through these simple supports that I think could be scaled to many creators, I think there's this additional piece whereby helping people in this way, you're helping them connect with this larger purpose and larger role that they might play in public health as a whole.
Absolutely. I remember when we first met, I approached you after the panel and I was like, this is such a great conversation. And I think I said, like, I guess I'm a creator. Like, I host this podcast on mental health. And you were like, yeah, like you are. And I never had that like self perception at all. I actively tried to avoid the word influencer because I think there are some people out there that their platform, it's not promoting maybe the things that I find valuable, right? So I've tried to actively kind of avoid that. But as I've just thought more about my own platform and how I want it to grow and how I want the messaging to be communicated to other people in a way that is acting like a creator. It's creating things. And it's also, I love that terminology that you use, being like a public health communicator or ambassador, because, at the end of the day, it's like really bringing to light these messages that are hopefully hitting a larger, widespread audience and really impacting their lives in a positive way. And I think there's an element of, when you're able to infuse the personal in it as well, and those lived experiences, that builds this basis of trust for your audience to then want to listen to you and actually want to invest in their well-being if that's what you're promoting. So I'm not surprised that that was this maybe unintentional, but really impactful for the creators that were involved in the summit, because even in the past year, the way I've thought about everyday endorphins and the messaging that I'm promoting and the way that I want to live my life, like I see this very much as an extension of myself, and it evolve and grow as my perspectives shape and form over time and throughout my life. So I think it also kind of empowers me, which I'm starting to lean into more now. But I love that you share that, because it's something that I also kind of see in myself too.
Yeah, I think creators, right? It's like creating something. I used to write short stories. I actually went to college as a double chemistry creative writing major.
I
And
was a
I think,
creative writing minor and I studied like neuroscience and psychology.
and I began as a double major and I ended with a chemistry major and a creative writing minor. But I think that one of the things that writing is a form of creating, right? What we're doing right now, this conversation, your podcast is a form of creation, right? Creating is one way that we make sense of the world around us, right? And help other people do the same. It is an amazing service to all of us. And I think the more we can think, yeah, less about folks on social. There are certainly folks who are going to be on social. Influencer is maybe the term that some people will use because it is they're advocating for trying to get you to do specific changes in your life. But I think that, like, there are a whole host of us who are interested in being advocates on those platforms, right? Advocating for things that we care about, advocating for the good of our community, of our world. And those, I think, are, those are public health communication goals. And I'm really hopeful that as we, continue this work, that's where we'll be able to help more creators think about themselves that way and then give them the support that they need to be powerful, more powerful than they already are. And hopefully we will learn something from them along the way. When our group of creators in the pilot were with us in August in person, some of them taught a class to our students and our faculty about how to build, advocacy platforms on social channels. And others built this really wonderful resource that's now being used around Harvard around how to build trust around health and science topics. So I think there's just so much that we have to learn internally also from them. So, sort of to come back to something we talked in the very beginning, in addition to sort of, helping more creators see themselves as public health communicators in these spaces and supporting their work and doing that, I'm really hoping that we continue to find ways to make it two-way and make sure that we're learning what we need to learn from creators. I think, one of the reasons I ended up at Harvard and I decided to take this job was having gone through COVID and felt like, public health, we could have done a better job communicating, the value of what it is to take care of one another. And I felt like, the skills that I had as a scientist, as a science journalist, were ones that I could could apply to that situation. And so I see this as an extension, right? The creators in our cohort are so good at that too. And I'm excited that Harvard has decided to, invest in trying to make sure that they can help tomorrow's public health, leaders in all corners are better communicators. And I think I'm really excited that they're, enthusiastic and excited about making these sort of new kinds of coalitions that might not have happened, pre-COVID.
Well, I'm very excited to see all the work that's going to continue to be done and progressed within the Center for Communication at Harvard. And, hopefully there's a part 2 with this Creators Summit.
More to come. Yeah.
And actually, one of the creators that was involved with the summit was a guest on the show, Victoria Garrick Brown, now, because she got married. Yeah, and she has a really fantastic platform from everything that she's done and also through her own lived experience and vulnerability that she shares. So I loved getting to, look on the website and see who you had involved. And even just in this interview, I feel like I learned so much. So thank you, Amanda. It's really been such a pleasure having you on the podcast. Before I let you go, there's one question that I ask everyone that comes onto the show, and it's really tied into the theme of everyday endorphins, seeking out those simple joys in life and returning to that, especially when times get a little bit difficult. But with that being said, what I'd love to hear from you is, what is something that brings you a bit of endorphins every day?
Dancing. It's funny, whenever I get nervous about something, right? Like have to give a speech, or I had to get in front of a board or something like that. The thing that I would always do is like put in my headphones and hide in my hotel room or in a little space and jam out. It's always been dancing. These days I do it a lot with my kids too. Yeah.
I love that. I mean, dancing's a big endorphin thrill for me. There's this one studio, I think they closed down, unfortunately. 305 Fitness. For anyone out there who's listening, it's a trip. It's really fun. It feels like you're in Miami and you're just having a time, but you're getting in a great workout. So I love to dance too. And there's just something very like, when you're just like moving to the beat of a rhythm, it's very calming and a great endorphin release as well. So
dance like nobody's watching, right?
exactly. Exactly. Amanda, where can my listeners connect with you and stay updated with all the emerging research that's coming out of Harvard and the Center for Communication?
Yeah, you can follow us on LinkedIn, Center for Health Communication at Harvard Chan, School of Public Health. All right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's lovely talking to you.